This video continues from the previous video. Okay, so space. Every shape or form has a place in space, and we define that space in our world often as a piece of property or a plan or the room or the foundation, right? So space for us just basically means where are we locating our shapes or forms within our context. And so space can not only refer to the area around, above, or below an object, but can also behind it. And objects, obviously, we know can occur in 3 dimensions. And over here on the right, you see these 3 different colored circles to differentiate them from one another. And the space is the page they're on. This could also be a property boundary, or it could be the area, the buildable area on our property, right? Because you can't build all the way to the edges in most of the cases. You have setbacks. It could also be furniture we're arranging inside of a room. It could be lights we're arranging on a ceiling plan. So it could be multiple things. So in a 2-dimensional settings, we're talking about everything happening on a flat surface, but there may be a 3rd dimension that's hidden. So in our case, we don't know. These could be cylinders. They could be spheres. It's hard to know without shadows. It's hard to know without value, without shading. And so if we add shadows, shading, overlap, sizing, that can help define that object's place in space. So when you're working with 2-dimensional drawings that you're going to give to a contractor, you're going to need to be able to add additional information to help them out. So positive space are the elements in the composition. This is, and this is. The negative space is the background. So we talked about these as figures and ground when we were talking about Gestalt. We're now talking about them as positive space and negative space. And here you can see, here the shapes are laid out, the circles are laid out on this within this space differently here and then differently here. And how they're laid out also talks about their relationship. For instance, here they're pretty much viewed as equals. They all have their own space. They're equidistant apart. Well, those are a little bit further apart, but they're mostly, equally distant apart. There's, they're different colors, but right now those colors don't necessarily have any meaning for us aside from color. They might have meaning. It might mean something. If I had colored them skin colors, they would have a different meaning than if I colored them these colors that I had colored them. Over here, there's a relationship between these 2 shapes because they're overlapping. And down here in the bottom, there is a relationship between all of them, and they appear in this composition. They're all huddled over here in the corner. They appear to be avoiding this space for some reason. We don't know what it is off the top of our heads. One of our favorite artists who plays with space is M.C. Escher. And he worked with positive space and negative space so that everything was designed. Here, let's start over here on the left side. This sky turned into birds. So here the background, the negative space, turned into the positive space over here. And vice versa. Here's the background, the negative space, turns into the positive space over here. It's really fascinating and interesting. So polygons are surfaces within space, and they can fold in certain ways to create very interesting visuals. And you see the space on the right, which we use the term in architecture as space to mean an interior space. And here you can see the use of polygons in the design. We use a lot of polygons in architecture. For instance, a cube, if you unfold it, right, you start to unfold the cube, you see that is a polygon with 6 sides. And so then you can, in this case with this building, you can see how these polygons begin to rotate in relationship to one another to create very interesting relationships that creates the spaces in which we live and work. Taliesin West, designed by the well-known architect Frank Lloyd Wright, was initially intended to be his home, but it ended up becoming more like I'm trying to think of the right words because I don't. Okay, so this is what he did. His interns came and lived in the house with him or on the property. He would have them construct their own residences on his property, but they would eat together. So it was this sort of this communal. It was a very weird relationship he had in terms of trying to define it because it was so fluid. Sometimes they were peers, sometimes there was a hierarchy, but this one out in Arizona, the space that they inhabited, the living space, you can see the juxtaposition of the planes. There's not two walls that go straight up that are equal, or four walls that go up that are straight equal in this room. There are different heights, and then the roof slants, and the materials wrap. And so it's a very interesting use of planes and forms, right, shapes, to create this space. Not typical at all. One of the reasons he's so famous is because of what he did. Color is actually one of the hardest ones to harness and probably one of the most challenging to understand. But color is one of people's favorite elements of design because it just adds so much to your space. You change the color, you change the mood, you change the psychology, you change the meaning, you change the subjective aspects of design, right? Because if people hate orange and you've made your project orange, you're going to get a reaction. So like the other elements, it has a few different properties. That's we refer to color as hue, saturation, and lightness. So when we talk about the term hue, we are very much talking about the base color. Color can be used sparingly. It can be used dominantly. It can be used in a variety of different arrangements, and that gets into color theory, and we are going to talk about that most definitely. Color wheel. We're going to talk a whole lot more about this. This is pulled from the spectrum of light that is visible to the human eye. And we can see roughly, based on that spectrum of light, we can see roughly 1 million different colors. And it depends on the hue, and then whether or not you add white or black, whether or not you add another color. So it starts creating all these different, this range of colors that we can pull from. And it's just a very broad spectrum. Here's an example of bright colors used in a building. And in order for this not to be obnoxious, and it almost is, they just stayed under the radar here. The rest of the building was black and white. And you're going to notice that if you're going to do something bold like this, you have to make sure that you are not doing it everywhere. In this case, it is one application on this face. I personally probably would have broken it up with pulling these elements out, and breaking it up a little bit more. But I get what they were trying to do. They were trying to, create this very fluid plane that ran throughout the whole building. To me, it's almost a little too much. And I love color. Another thing you could have done is like maybe taken out. So that orange is really, really saturated. I mean, you could have toned it down or used different paints, right? And this is what we do. We start critiquing other people's work once we understand it. Could it have been different? Could it have been better? And I'm sure they explored all that. And we just do that. How do we, and so it's just part of the process of understanding or trying to understand. And when you do that, when you start to say, well, what if they did this? What if they did that? You start to get answers. And from there, you start to understand what it is they've done and why they've done it. Because that will happen to you a lot when you're working on something. People go, well, what if you did this? What if you did that? And you'll go, well, I already tried this and this happened. And I already tried that, this happened. And I will tell you 95% of your conversations with people who start out with, what if you did this, will end up with, oh, I get it now. Whoops, I'm trying to get my mouse to work here and it's, come on. Okay, and so here is a building that is covered in multicolor foil. So that depending on how the sun hit it, it reflected different colors. So it became basically kind of iridescent. And you can see it looks much more iridescent in this model they created of it. But this is the actual building. And so they created that panel on the exterior so that however the sun hit it, it created interesting different colors. That's pretty cool. I do wonder, though, what it would be like to be inside that building and have the colors, that much color around you. Interesting. Okay, value. When we talk about value, we are talking about the lightness or the darkness of a color. And I'm just going to jump over here to this apple. The apple is clearly a three-dimensional object, and we achieve that even though it's flat. This is not a painting. Not a photo, it's a painting. We achieve that through darken, lighten, shadow. And that gives that illusion of three dimension. And we as humans can have our eye very easily fooled by these illusions. Our eyes won't know the difference. You got to touch it and find out that it's not actually an apple. So when we see these things, because the way light reflects off objects, so in this case, you can see that bright gash on the apple. That's where the light is hitting it. And let's just say it's a studio light. The light's hitting it here. And that's why it's brightest. That's why it's bright white, because there's the most light hitting it. As we move away, the light starts to bounce and it starts to soften. And then where the light isn't hitting it, it's dark. And then where the light is bouncing and hitting it, right? Some of it's getting absorbed because this is white. It's absorbing a lot of light. Reflecting a lot of light. So it's bouncing, and then where it hits the back, it's dark, but it's not as dark where there's none hitting. So it's all very, very complicated, but it's also very simple in the sense that there's a formula for how you can create a three-dimensional shape or draw a three-dimensional shape using value to give the illusion of that third dimension. Value is the key to the illusion of light. And grayscale is part of that value, right? So we go from white to black and the series of grays in between, and that those values give us our three dimensions. So our mind will process the light and then try to rationalize what we're seeing. So for instance, if you turn off all the light, we won't see anything. We need light in order to see, because we need that light to bounce off, hit objects to illuminate them, but also to bounce off objects to give us a sense of depth and perception. And in order to create contrast, which is part of three dimensions, we have to understand light and how it reacts on surfaces. And value is the key to creating that contrast between the shadows and the highlights that give and define depth within a space. Value on the stairs over here on the left allows us to perceive the contrast that defines their height and depth in order for us to see and then climb them. And so I don't know if you guys have ever read this, but stairs by code are required to be equal. And that is because once you step on one or two, your brain will process the rest of them and you'll go from there. Okay, see you guys in the next video.